second thing is that I was going to go over an assignment called The Changing Forms of Carbon, and it comes from Earth Science, Semester 2. This is in Unit 1. The actual lesson is 1.4.2, which I'll pull up here in a second. But I think students get a little bit confused as we're talking about how, talking about cycles and kind of the interconnections between cycles, how cycles work together, how they provide parts or products, we'll say, to other cycles. And so they rely on each other to continue the cycle going. And so we're going to be looking at here, of course, the carbon cycle, which is how carbon is transformed on Earth, how it changes, just like we have, like the water cycle and the nitrogen cycle. So we have all these materials on Earth, and it's like they're being recycled. They transform throughout their life period, we'll say life period, so to speak. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what carbon is. Carbon is naturally found here on Earth, and amazingly, it's in everything, even our bodies. So living organisms are made of carbon, and as living organisms, as all organisms, we have a life cycle, and as we die, our bodies then break down, and then that carbon is released back onto Earth. And so it's a pretty cool cycle here to think about. And so within the carbon cycle, we've got areas where carbon is used, and we've got areas where carbon is produced or put out back into Earth. And hopefully we have this nice cycle where it's even and we're not putting too much carbon back onto Earth or removing too much carbon. You probably heard more about more carbon being added onto Earth through, of course, human processes, which we'll talk about here. Okay, so let's look at the major steps of the carbon cycle. They're pretty simple. So big one we're going to start with is plants. So who uses carbon dioxide? So as we think about using carbon up, there's certain organisms that need carbon. And we think about plants, and plants are producers. That means that they can produce their own food using sunlight, carbon dioxide, and of course, water. So when we think about carbon is this natural material. It's an element, so it's the purest form. Carbon can't be broken down into anything else. But we know that carbon can combine with oxygen here and make carbon dioxide. So plants use carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, so to make their own food. Animals get carbon by eating plants or by eating other animals. We're ingesting or consuming that carbon. Okay, so again, thinking about photosynthesis, this is the primary food source, the foundation of all of our food energy cycles here is those producers. So those producers are sucking up that carbon into their pores, and using that to produce food. Thank goodness. Carbon is returned to an inorganic state in a number of ways. So how is then carbon released back onto Earth? So we have to have this balance, okay? Plants producers are using that carbon for photosynthesis. So then how does the carbon get put back, released? Well, a couple different ways, like we talked about. When an animal or plant dies, it's broken down by bacteria and fungi, and that carbon is released, decomposition, released back into the Earth. Also through respiration. So as you think about humans, most organisms, we breathe in oxygen and then we respire carbon dioxide. So our body uses up oxygen, and then that byproduct is carbon dioxide. So it's pretty cool to think about. Plants are thinking about breathing in carbon dioxide, giving off oxygen. Other organisms like ourselves are breathing in oxygen and giving off carbon dioxide. So nice little trade-off there. Sometimes instead of completely decomposing, a plant and animal can be fossilized, and this can lead to fossil fuels. So deep down in the earth and sedimentary rock over millions and millions of years, the remains of these organisms get kind of squished together, pressurized, and it becomes these fossil fuels like oil, coal, and natural gas. Okay, let's take a look at a picture here. We also know probably the biggest source of carbon emissions is through as we think about humans. So when we drive our cars, when we burn fossil fuels, factories, all of those different sources, as they're burning that energy to get energy, they have a byproduct, a waste product, and that's carbon. And so we'll see that coming back into our atmosphere. So here's a very simple kind of image of carbon. And the arrows are showing, like the red arrows here are showing where carbon is put onto the atmosphere, put back into the atmosphere on Earth. And then the blue arrow is showing places where carbon is used up. Okay, so again, green plants absorb that carbon for photosynthesis. So here carbon is being used. Okay, we also have here, you know, these plants are producing, they're using that carbon to produce sugar, and then other organisms consume them. So it's food, and so then as we consume that, that carbon goes into the organism's body. Okay. Ways that then carbon is released as we see the combustion of fuel. So here's an example, you know, this house is burning a fuel, you know, that carbon is then released into the atmosphere. This cow here is respiring, so it's breathing in oxygen and exhaling, respiring carbon dioxide, goes back to the atmosphere. We can also say through gases, they can give off materials, waste products. Yeah, there's some carbon in that. And then, of course, if the organism dies, then that carbon is released back into the earth. So it's a continuous cycle of carbon being used and carbon being released. Carbon being used, carbon being released. We do know that at times that we can get that carbon cycle out of whack. And we hear about this now. You might be hearing about global warming, climate change, and they believe that that is being caused because humans, and we look at our carbon levels, we are producing more carbon. We're putting more carbon into the earth by this use of factories, driving cars. You can see big uses of carbon dioxide going back into our atmosphere. So it's becoming unbalanced. Okay, but let's get to, I put a little bit more in here about fuel for humans. Yes, how oil and gas are made. So again, we talked about carbon stored in fossil fuels is released when it's burned. So when we're burning this oil, gas, coal, we're releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere. This release is what we call carbon dioxide emission, which is each different fossil fuel emitting a different amount of carbon dioxide, as well as carbon monoxide and soot, other kind of particles that go along with it. They're putting all of this up into our atmosphere, adding to more carbon. Okay, so let's take a look at this activity 142, changing forms of carbon. This is a tricky one for students because it's asking them to kind of analyze this picture and then kind of write up a few, a little bit of information to summarize that. So use the image below, describe in at least 2 paragraphs what is happening with the arrows. Name and explain the process and the changing forms of carbon. To conclude, predict what the numbers might represent. So we're looking at an example, a picture of kind of a little ecosystem and a cycle of an ecosystem. And what we're looking at is the different arrows. What do the different arrows mean? Okay. So here's our picture. And then if we go to the actual directions here, below it, it says below is a suggestion on how your paragraph should be laid out and what terms to include in each paragraph. So they're telling you like, okay, so how you're going to do this is in first paragraph number 1, include this and use these words. Paragraph 2, you're going to explain this and then use these words to help in your paragraph explain what is going on, how the carbon is changing. So in paragraph 1, you want to explain places where carbon is being added to the atmosphere. So you're looking for arrows that are showing it going up. We're putting it into the atmosphere. So you're looking at here, you're looking at this one with the arrow going up, going up, going up, going up, going up, okay? It says process to include here could be things like burning, respiration, decay, weathering, and of course runoff. So what we want to do is explain in that first paragraph where carbon is being put into the atmosphere using the picture. So we can see here Here's a big one, deforestation and land use change. So we see some fires going on, cutting down some trees. We're burning that material. So of course we've got carbon being released from whatever it is that they're burning of those trees. That carbon is being put back into the atmospheres right there. Let's see, same with volcanoes. In the event that there is a volcano that erupts or it becomes active, it's releasing gases that are trapped within the earth, and that's going to release carbon into our atmosphere as well. We got respiration. We got soil respiration from decomposition. So that's when organisms die. Their bodies decompose and decay. It releases that carbon back into the atmosphere. Here's our plant respiration. Okay, releasing that carbon back. Burning of fossil fuels as well, driving of cars, all ways they're going in here. So you would explain in here, you could pick a few of them to explain, you know, in the picture, the arrows, you can see that carbon is being emitted back into the atmosphere through processes like the burning of fossil fuels from factories and cars, respiration of organisms. Okay. Paragraph 2, places where carbon is being pulled out of the atmosphere. So where is then carbon being used up? These steps here might include things like photosynthesis, storage, sedimentation, diffusion. And so here we can see we're looking for arrows going down. Okay, so we know that the ocean is kind of sucking up some of that carbon into the water. We know that photosynthesis is taking place and bringing all of that water in. Okay. If you're looking, if you can see this picture, you can even see numbers, and the numbers represent kind of the amounts of carbon that's being used. So here, as you can see, photosynthesis, it's the largest by far number right there, 120. So it's sucking up lots of that carbon to be used, okay? And then the last thing you want to do is finally come up with a hypothesis or an educated guess on what the arrows, the numbers in the arrows might mean, which I just helped you figure that out. So there is a little legend and a little key there that kind of gives you, it says units, and then it says pools and fluxes. So this is where it is kind of collecting and where it's kind of flexing or changing the amount. So you can see this is kind of the amount. So in some instances, some of these processes are going to take up more carbon and some of them are going to release less carbon. So the numbers are giving us an idea about how much, kind of the percentage, so to speak, or the chunk of carbon that is being added or released. Okay. Of course, in the assignment, there is a rubric. Okay. So in assignments that are not teacher generated or computer generated, that are kind of like questions, multiple choice questions, you always get these rubrics, and these rubrics tell you exactly what it is that you need to do. So again, in this activity, you will review what you just learned about the carbon cycle. You will look at the picture and then write 2 paragraphs that describe the process in changing forms of carbon. Review the rubric to see how you will be graded. Okay, so again, going over rubrics, which I absolutely love because one, they tell you exactly kind of the point value here. You know, if you're looking to exceed that expectation and get the full amount of points, then here you go. It shows you exactly what it is that you need to do. Okay, it's nice because you can use this rubric as a way to lay out your assignments and make sure that, you know, sometimes just that whole process of starting an assignment is so overwhelming. With rubrics, it's like you can just kind of copy, you know, you can take all of these kind of criteria that you need to do and just put that out maybe in your document and then go through and make sure that you're addressing each part of it. I also love it because it helps you be able to grade yourself. Okay, so let's take a look. There are 4 different categories. So this is what you're being assessed on. We've got the arrows explained. So here, student correctly explained what all the arrows show. So again, in that first paragraph, second paragraph, in the directions, you need to explain what the arrows mean. So you're using things like photosynthesis to explain where carbon is being taken in. Sorry, I'm going the other way. The arrow for photosynthesis, that arrow is pointing downward, so that carbon is being used by producers. And the arrows that are going upwards, we know that then carbon is being released back into the atmosphere. Name and explain the processes of the carbon cycle. Okay, here we go. Student correctly names and explains the processes in the carbon cycle, including photosynthesis, respiration, and decomposition. So within your paragraphs, you need to make sure that you're explaining those three processes. So again, photosynthesis, carbon is producers are using carbon and pulling carbon in for photosynthesis. Respiration, organisms are respiring and they're giving off carbon back into the atmosphere. Decomposition, organisms die, their bodies decay and break down, and as they do so, they release that carbon through decomposition. Your prediction, okay, a prediction of what at least three of the numbers might mean is included. So you are explaining what you think those numbers mean. And again, we talked about those kind of being the amount or the ratio, percentage of how much carbon each one of those processes is releasing out. And then of course your grammar and your punctuation. Make sure to use paragraphs and always make sure to use capital letters, capitalization, and punctuation. Okay, so let me show you an example. This is an example that a student just did not too long ago. So let's take a little look here. It says, the student wrote, all living things are made of carbon, such as fuels we humans use for energy. Human activity adds carbon to the atmosphere. For example, burning a fossil fuel releases carbon dioxide emission. Converting oil, coal, natural gas, plants, and organic soil into carbon dioxide, which accumulating in our atmosphere. Animals and plants also contribute to the carbon cycle. For example, when animals and plants die, it's broken down by bacteria and fungi, and the carbon is released, becoming decomposed. Sometimes a plant or animal won't decompose entirely, and it can be fossilized, making fossil fuel. So in that first paragraph, they explained three ways that carbon is added to our atmosphere. Okay, so they talked about burning of fossil fuels, how fossil fuels are made, the decomposition of plants. Pretty cool. Okay, so they did a good job explaining the ways that carbon is being added to our atmosphere. Let's go to the second paragraph. As carbon adds to our atmosphere, it also takes away. Plants, like so many other things, use carbon dioxide, but plants rely on it for photosynthesis. By doing so, it removes inorganic carbon, it incorporates it into the plant tissue, and animals get carbon from eating plants. When an animal breathes, it exhales the carbon dioxide. Trees also have an impact on the carbon cycle. When trees are growing, they take carbon dioxide for the atmosphere. So here they're explaining how, again, carbon is used for photosynthesis. When other organisms eat producers or plants, we're getting that carbon into our bodies as well. Okay. And then the last part, I believe that the arrows and numbers represent the increase or decrease of carbon dioxide levels, and the arrows will represent each other that makes our carbon dioxide cycle. Hello, welcome. We're just talking about the carbon cycle here. Okay. So as we think about the rubric, okay, did the student, let's go back to it. Arrows, were they explained? Yes. Paragraph 1, they talked about the arrow coming down where carbon is being, in paragraph 1, they talked about where carbon is being released. Paragraph 2, they talked about where carbon is being used. Name and explain the processes in the carbon cycle. We are looking to include photosynthesis, respiration, and decomposition, and the student addressed each one of those. Prediction, that last part, student gave a prediction about what they think those numbers represent. And then the last one, grammar and punctuation. Yeah, I think they did a great job on all of these. You know, there was a couple little, errors, just needed to go back and maybe reread it. I think I saw one, maybe we needed, I thought I saw a capital letter that needed to be capitalized, but maybe it's just me reading through it. So again, here's a good example of a student that used that rubric and looked through it, completed the criteria that was needed for that assignment. So this is a good example, I think, of a high scoring 1.4.2, the changing forms of carbon. So some things to think about as you walk away. Always use those rubrics. Again, you can copy and paste, copy out what the criteria is and use that as your guide as you're working on your assignment. I think it helps kind of symbolize it, makes it a whole lot easier for you. and let you know exactly what needs to be done. So again, also that rubric, when you complete your assignment, go back to your rubric and assess yourself. Look over it. Did I do this part? Yes, check it off. Okay. So you can see exactly what you're going to be doing. I think it's pretty cool to think about the carbon and the carbon cycle, how this is continuously happening here on Earth, and we don't even think about it, right? All of these processes are just occurring, and it's a great big cycle with everything interacting together. I love it. I love science. Pretty cool. Okay. So that is what I have today on, again, the changing forms of carbon, Earth Science, Semester 2, Unit 1.